I wanted to ask you a few
Some questions,
questions
yeah.
about why did you decide to write about that subject?
The impulse or the compulsion to do it.
It was meant to be a happy moment in royal history, a special honor for young Prince Louis, but inside the palace, it caused a major upset. When the royal family quietly announced that Prince Louis had been given a historic title once held by war heroes and senior royals, the public saw it as a sweet step into tradition. But for Queen Camilla, it felt like a betrayal. No matter how high her position, her own family would never be part of the royal bloodline. Camilla had quietly pushed for her grandson to get recognition, hoping King Charles would support her. But instead, Kate and William gave their youngest son a title her family could never have. Camilla may be queen, but the future of the monarchy had moved on. Without her, this title didn't just honor a young prince, it reignited old tensions behind palace walls. And this time, the bold move didn't come from Charles. It came from Kate. The announcement came without warning. Buried inside a brief update in the court circular, the royal family confirmed that Prince Louis, age 6, had been granted a title last held by a senior royal more than a century ago. No press conference, no formal ceremony. Just a line of text, easy to miss, unless you knew what to look for. Inside the palace, everyone noticed. It was not just any honorific, it was one historically linked with military command, land governance, and high ceremonial rank. For a child still in primary school to receive it, the implications were immediate. Prince Louis wasn't just being recognized, he was being positioned. Public reaction was swift. Commentators hailed the move as a symbol of continuity, praising Louis's growing role within the monarchy. Newspapers revisited his most charming public moments, framing the title as a natural next step for the cheeky, well-loved royal. But within the palace, the tone was different. It was calculated, deliberate, and strategic. For months, William and Kate had pushed for more formal recognition of their children's roles, not for performance or pageantry, but for service and symbolism. They saw their youngest son's rising popularity and understood its weight. Louis wasn't just a spare, he was becoming an asset, a bridge between formality and relatability. This title reflected that shift. The idea had been in motion since the early months following Queen Elizabeth's death. With the monarchy in transition and Charles settling into his reign, the Wales household began reshaping its future. Prince George was already positioned as the heir. Princess Charlotte, admired for her poise, had emerged as a dignified second. But Louis offered something different, a mix of humor, honesty, and charm that gave the public a glimpse of authenticity. Assigning him a title rooted in royal history wasn't just a nod to tradition. It was a message. The next generation was here, and it wasn't waiting. Camilla noticed immediately. For years, she had been quietly encouraging the integration of her own family into royal life. Her children, Tom and Laura, had never received titles, and her grandson, though present at select events, had always been on the fringe of palace affairs. In private, she had floated the idea of offering him a courtesy role. Nothing dynastic, just enough to show inclusion. The suggestion never gained traction. Now, with Louis's sudden elevation, the message was unmistakable. William and Kate had acted without consulting her. The king had signed off on it, and her family was still on the outside. Behind closed doors, staff reported tension. Camilla canceled meetings, avoided calls, and appeared visibly unsettled at scheduled appearances. Aides described her as deeply rattled. But the damage had already been done. William and Kate had effectively signaled that the line of succession wasn't just about birthright, it was about narrative, public favor, and symbolic dominance. By granting Louis a historic title, they had pulled rank without speaking a word. Camilla, who had spent years maneuvering her way into royal acceptance, found herself outpaced by a child not yet 10. The Waleses had moved first, and in the royal world, first moves often win. From the moment Prince Louis was born, he was the third wheel in a perfectly balanced royal trio. Prince George was the heir, Princess Charlotte, the poised and polished spare. And Louis? He was the cheeky afterthought, the toddler pulling faces on palace balconies, waving at jets during parades, and becoming a meme before he could spell his own name. But inside palace walls, that image was quietly shifting. And the title he was just granted didn't appear out of thin air. It was the result of a calculated transformation, one that reframed Louis not just as the monarchy's mischievous mascot, but as a strategic piece in the royal machine. From the outside, Louis's appeal looked effortless. The British public fell in love with his authenticity. Unlike the stiff protocol that sometimes made royal appearances feel rehearsed, Louis was spontaneous. His antics during the Platinum Jubilee, squirming, yawning, covering his ears, weren't signs of disobedience. They were proof of something the royal family desperately needed: relatability. While Prince George carried the weight of being king-in-waiting, and Charlotte was often praised for her maturity beyond her years, Louis brought humanity to the royal image, a real child with real emotions. And for a monarchy navigating modern relevance, that kind of presence had power. But this was more than just charm. Behind the curtain, William and Kate were paying close attention. They understood the soft power Louis was generating. Crowds at royal events increasingly cheered his name. Photo ops featuring Louis drew more engagement than some working royals' entire schedules. For a child, technically years away from taking on formal duties, Louis was already commanding public attention. That attention translated into opportunity, and William and Kate seized it. According to palace insiders, the decision to assign Louis a historic title wasn't rushed. It had been discussed in private family meetings and over quiet sessions with senior aides. William had made it clear. This was about establishing permanence. His children weren't background figures. They were the monarchy's next act, and in a post-Elizabeth era, the public needed reassurance. Not just that the monarchy would continue, but that it would evolve with faces they trusted. Louis offered something none of the older royals could manufacture: innocence. He had no scandals, no history, no baggage. He was born into the most watched family in the world, and yet remained untouched by controversy. In the public's eyes, that made him precious. In the palace's strategy books, it made him perfect. The title chosen for him was no accident. Its previous holders were senior royals known for their service, regional command, and loyalty to the crown. It hadn't been used in generations until now. Assigning it to Louis was more than ceremonial. It placed him firmly on the royal ladder, not just as the fun one in family photos, but as a future face of the institution. Observers noted the shift immediately. Royal correspondents flagged the rarity of such a move. Constitutional experts quietly updated diagrams of the royal household. Behind the scenes, aides began adjusting event rosters, noting that Louis would likely have more visibility in the years ahead. This wasn't a gesture, it was positioning. For Camilla, that fact was impossible to ignore. Her own grandson, a child she had quietly championed for years, remained titleless, unnamed in royal communications, and absent from public honors. Meanwhile, Louis, still in primary school, was being pulled forward. But for William, this was never about Camilla. It was about control. He had long viewed the monarchy's power as something best anchored in lineage, not alliances. His mother, Diana, had taught him the dangers of mixing royal tradition with emotional compromise, and he'd learned the lesson well. In his eyes, Louis's title was not just deserved, it was necessary. It placed a firm boundary around the future. Diana's legacy would not be diluted. The next generation would carry her spirit, not share it with others who had only entered the family through marriage. Kate echoed this sentiment, though she voiced it differently. For her, it was about reinforcing duty. Her children were raised to understand responsibility. Titles were not just names, they were symbols of service. Louis's growth into a beloved public figure only reinforced that he was ready for the role, even if the role was largely symbolic for now. But even symbols matter, especially in a family where optics dictate power, and every move is archived by tabloids, historians, and the public. By giving Louis this title, William and Kate sent a clear message. The future of the crown would be built by those born to it, not absorbed by convenience, not handed down to please others, and not shared for political peace. Louis may still be learning to tie his shoes, but in the eyes of the monarchy, he's already part of the architecture. And for those watching closely, his quiet promotion wasn't just a family moment. It was a shift in the royal order. For years, Queen Camilla played the long game. She never demanded attention, never asked for headlines, and never publicly pushed for her family's inclusion in royal life. But quietly, consistently, she made moves, small gestures, strategic appearances, always subtle, always careful, because what Camilla wanted more than anything was acknowledgement, not just for herself, but for her children and grandchildren. Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes, Camilla's children from her first marriage, were never given titles. That was expected. They were private citizens, born outside the royal framework. But when Camilla married Charles and became queen consort, a new window opened, at least in her eyes. Her grandson, still a child, suddenly seemed closer to the royal stage. Camilla believed that the monarchy could evolve, not by rewriting the bloodline, but by extending symbolic roles to reflect the blended family it had become. Over the years, she tested the waters. Her grandson was photographed at royal events. He was seated near senior royals at garden parties. Occasionally, she would suggest, never too forcefully, that perhaps he could be given a small ribbon, a medal, even a ceremonial honor to mark his place in the larger family. It wasn't about inheritance, it was about visibility, inclusion. But nothing came of it. Inside palace circles, Camilla's quiet campaign was acknowledged but never embraced. William, in particular, remained firm on where he drew the line. While he treated Camilla with public respect, there was no appetite for elevating her relatives into royal positions, not even symbolically. For William, legacy mattered more than appearances, and that legacy was rooted in his mother. Camilla's efforts were met with polite indifference. Her grandson remained unnamed in the court circulars. He received no invites to high-level royal events, and while the press occasionally mentioned him as a royal relation, he was never seen as part of the monarchy's core. That made Louis's sudden promotion even harder to swallow. Camilla had spent years delicately working to bring her family into the fold. She had waited, smiled, stayed silent, and then, in one quiet decision, with no warning and no conversation, Prince Louis was vaulted ahead. A young boy with no official duties, still years away from formal service, was handed a historic title Camilla had dreamed might one day go to her own grandson. It wasn't just a snub, it was a dismissal. According to palace aides, Camilla was devastated, not because of the title itself, but because of what it represented. That after everything she had endured, everything she had navigated, her family was still seen as outsiders. Not royal, not essential, not part of the future, and more importantly, not even considered. For Camilla, who had waited decades to be accepted, the message was crystal clear. Acceptance had limits, and her family, no matter how close to the crown, had just hit theirs. Inside the royal family, boundaries are rarely spoken aloud, but they are enforced with surgical precision. And when Prince Louis received his new title, that invisible line snapped into full view. At the surface, the move looked harmless, a ceremonial honor given to a beloved young prince. But inside the palace, it was understood as something far more significant. It was a message, quietly delivered and impossible to misinterpret. Diana's children and their children are the face of the monarchy. Everyone else, no matter how close to the crown, remains secondary. Camilla had always known she wasn't part of that inner circle. Not truly. No matter how many royal duties she fulfilled or how carefully she navigated palace politics, she could never alter the bloodline. Diana's legacy was etched into every corridor of the monarchy, not just in portraits or commemorative days, but in the people. William, in particular, had made it clear that his loyalty wasn't just to his title, but to the memory of his mother. And now that loyalty had extended to the next generation. Prince Louis wasn't just being celebrated because of who he was being recognized because of who he came from. The youngest child of William and Kate, and the grandson of Princess Diana. A boy born into a legacy the public adored, trusted, and felt connected to. That lineage carried weight, not only emotionally, but politically. Camilla's family couldn't compete with that. Her children, though raised with care and decency, were not born into royal tradition. Her grandson, the one she had quietly championed for recognition, carried no royal blood at all. And for a monarchy built on heritage, that distinction mattered more than anyone dared to admit. Even within palace ranks, staff referred to the Wales children as the future of the firm. They were visible, included, trained for public life from an early age. George, Charlotte, and Louis weren't just symbols. They were investments. The public celebrated them. The institution protected them. Every move they made reinforced the crown's relevance in a modern age. Meanwhile, Camilla's grandchildren were ghost figures, present but unmentioned, smiling at family events, but never named in royal briefings. Even their seating at formal occasions reflected the unspoken hierarchy. Close, but not close enough. Camilla had tried to blur that line. For years, she had advocated, gently but persistently, for some form of recognition. She didn't seek grandeur. She asked for ceremony, for acknowledgement, something to say, "Your family matters too." But each time, the answer was silence. Then came Louis's title, a move that felt to her like a final decision, not just about her grandson, but about her place. It made clear that the royal family was drawing its future path with absolute clarity, that only Diana's descendants would carry it forward. Camilla, for all her efforts, remained an honored guest, not a founding pillar. According to sources close to the palace, the title announcement shifted the internal dynamics. Charles, already walking a tightrope between personal loyalty and institutional duty, offered no protest. William's position was firm. Kate, though silent, was unmistakably present in the outcome. And Camilla, watching from the sidelines, realized the conversation was already over. It was never about titles. It was about legacy, influence, who gets remembered, and who gets erased. In that moment, the difference between the two families became unavoidably stark. Diana's children were heirs to the kingdom. Camilla's would always be guests. The line wasn't just invisible anymore, it had been etched into the crown itself. Catherine, Princess of Wales, has often been called many things: graceful, dutiful, elegant, but rarely has she been labeled what she truly is: strategic. For years, Kate has navigated the royal machine with surgical precision. She speaks softly, dresses modestly, and plays the long game. While others shout for influence, she waits. While others push, she prepares. And this time, when Prince Louis was quietly granted a title that would rattle the palace walls, it bore her fingerprints, not in words, but in results. No one inside the institution underestimated Kate's public appeal. From the moment she joined the royal family, she won over crowds with her humility and restraint. She was the modern-day royal who seemed to understand both tradition and public sentiment. But what many failed to see, or chose to ignore, was that behind the scenes, she was always studying, always learning the inner mechanics of power. Following Queen Elizabeth II's death, the royal family entered a subtle period of transition. Charles ascended to the throne. Camilla, now queen consort, began stepping into a broader role. And somewhere in the background, Kate began laying the groundwork for what would become a defining moment in her family's legacy. Camilla had ambitions. She had waited decades to stand beside the king, and with that came a quiet push to integrate her family more deeply into royal life. Her children appeared at more public events. Her grandchildren, though without titles, were carefully placed in photographers' paths. It was a subtle campaign, not demanding, but deliberate. Camilla was trying to rewrite her narrative, not just as the woman who survived scandal, but as a matriarch, a permanent fixture in the next chapter of royal history. Kate noticed, but she didn't push back publicly. She didn't remove Camilla's grandchildren from photo ops or fight over ceremonial roles. She remained cordial, smiling, silent, and waited for the right moment to reassert what she knew to be true. The monarchy's future wasn't about who married in. It was about who was born for it. That moment came in the form of Prince Louis. In the public eye, Louis was the mischievous youngest sibling, the cheeky grin on the Buckingham Palace balcony, the boy covering his ears at royal flyovers. But behind the scenes, Kate understood what his growing popularity meant. He wasn't just adorable, he was powerful. The public adored him because he felt real, human, and in a royal family still recovering from scandal and modern scrutiny, that authenticity was priceless. So, when discussions began about which young royal might receive the next ceremonial title, Kate stepped forward, quietly. According to palace insiders, she made her case softly, never in front of cameras. She spoke to William's advisors, shared thoughts with Charles's team during briefings, never demanding, never forceful, but always intentional. She emphasized Louis's connection to the public, his natural presence, his ability to represent a new kind of monarchy, one that didn't rely on rigid tradition, but on relatability and grace. And over time, the argument stuck. Even Charles, facing growing pressure to maintain institutional stability, saw the wisdom in it. William, protective of his children and fiercely loyal to his mother's legacy, didn't hesitate. He approved the move without question. And just like that, Prince Louis was elevated, not through pomp and spectacle, but through a single quietly issued title. Kate didn't celebrate. She didn't release a statement or give an interview. Instead, she appeared at a charity function the next day wearing a muted green coat dress. She held Louis's hand, smiled for the cameras, and walked forward, as if nothing had changed, but everything had. That one move had reset the palace dynamic. Without confrontation, without open conflict, Kate had outmaneuvered Camilla. She didn't need Charles's permission or the media's praise. She had something far more valuable: timing, discipline, and public trust. Those close to her say this was never about revenge or rivalry. It was about protecting the legacy of the woman who had been pushed aside for too long, Diana, and about ensuring that her children, especially Louis, would never have to fight for acknowledgement the way their grandmother once did. Kate's strategy wasn't loud, but it was lethal, and in the end, it was effective. She reminded the institution and Camilla that true power isn't always worn on your head. Sometimes it's held in your silence. And when you're 10 steps ahead, you don't need to announce checkmate. Camilla had played it cool for days. When the title announcement for Prince Louis broke across British media, she smiled for the cameras at a hospital charity visit. She wore pearls, she shook hands, she nodded politely when asked about upcoming engagements. But inside, something was unraveling. For a woman who had spent decades mastering composure, surviving scandal, tabloid scorn, and the icy disdain of Diana loyalists, this was different. This wasn't about bad press or public perception. It was personal. It was about power, and more specifically, the lack of it. The breaking point came over breakfast. A tabloid cover story had landed on the table. Prince Louis, the crown's darling. The article gushed over his charm, his blossoming public image, and, most damning of all, the ancient title he now carried. But it was the final line that triggered Camilla's collapse. A sign that the future of the monarchy belongs to Diana's bloodline. She read it once, then again. According to a palace aide, she dropped the newspaper on the floor and stood in silence for several seconds. Then came the sound of porcelain shattering. A silver teapot slid off the table. A plate was shoved aside with enough force to crack. And then came the voice. Her voice. Camilla, normally reserved and tightly controlled, erupted. Her scream echoed down the hallway of Clarence House. Staff froze. Several aides rushed to shut nearby doors. But it was too late. The queen consort was no longer composed. She was livid. "Is my family a joke to them?" she reportedly shouted. "They've handed a crown to Diana's ghost and erased mine in the process." It wasn't just about Louis. It was about everything. The years she had stood by Charles, the decades she had waited, the effort she had made to appear palatable to the British public. All of it now felt like a performance for an audience that never intended to clap. And the final act, in her mind, had played out without her even being in the script. She stormed through Clarence House, demanding to speak with Charles. He was in his private study. And what followed, according to an eyewitness, was one of the most volatile arguments of their marriage. "They've humiliated me," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "You've humiliated me. You let them walk over my family like we don't exist." Charles tried to stay calm. He reminded her that the decision was made with the institution in mind, that the monarchy was entering a new phase, that William's children needed positioning. But Camilla wasn't listening. Her fury wasn't about the reasoning, it was about the implication that her family would never be part of that future. She reminded Charles of the quiet promises, of the gentle conversations about bringing her grandson into ceremonial life, of the belief that once she wore the crown, her family would be treated with some semblance of respect. Now, none of that mattered. "They've erased my family," she reportedly whispered at the end of it all, "and you just let them." That afternoon, Camilla canceled 2 public appearances. The official word from the palace was that she was resting. In reality, Clarence's house was locked down. Senior aides were told to stay out of sight. Only her most trusted staff were permitted into her quarters. One longtime assistant said the tension was thicker than it had ever been. Not even during the worst of the Diana-era headlines had Camilla been this emotionally volatile. Behind closed doors, she sat alone. Not just humiliated, but betrayed. And worse, replaced. Because, while Camilla raged in private, Catherine was already moving forward, calm, composed, and silent. In Camilla's world, silence had always been a strategy, but now it was the sound of her influence collapsing. For King Charles, the throne was never just a symbol of power. It was a balancing act, a legacy of duty inherited from his mother, a promise of continuity in a country bound by tradition. But in recent months, the burden of that crown had shifted. It was no longer about policy or pageantry. It had become deeply personal. Camilla's outburst over Prince Louis's title had shaken more than just the household. It rattled the foundation of their marriage. Charles had seen her fury before, during their years in the shadows, in the thick of public criticism. But this was different. She wasn't angry at the world. She was angry at him. He had authorized the title, quietly, formally. He knew it would sting, but he didn't expect the fallout to be this severe. Camilla saw it as a betrayal, a final confirmation that Diana's children would always come first. And William? He had made his position clear. There would be no negotiation. His children, especially Louis, were not to be sidelined. Not for ceremony, not for compromise. Charles was left in the middle, caught between a wife demanding recognition and a son defending legacy. A king trying to keep the monarchy unified while watching it fracture within his own family. And there was no winning this fight. Prince Louis's title was never just about ceremony. It was a line in the sand, a quiet but definitive shift in royal strategy. While the world saw a sweet nod to a young prince, those inside the palace recognized it for what it truly was, a public declaration of where the monarchy's future lies. With one silent gesture, the crown passed the torch. Not to Camilla's family, not to blended claims, but firmly to Diana's bloodline. Louis, barely old enough to understand what he represents, now stands as a living symbol of legacy. Not just royalty by birth, but trust by design. Camilla, though she wears the crown, now finds herself standing outside of the story she once believed she had helped shape. And Kate, she didn't have to raise her voice, she didn't have to stage a confrontation. She played the game the way only she could, through grace, through timing, through understanding the pulse of a nation still haunted by the memory of Diana. In the quiet halls of Buckingham Palace, the power has shifted, not with noise, not with crowns or cameras, but with quiet moves made by a woman who understands that legacy isn't claimed, it's earned. Kate didn't just elevate her son, she secured her place in history as the architect of the monarchy's future. One title, one boy, one perfectly timed move, and the entire institution shifted. And it's not coming back. If you found this royal drama just as fascinating as we did, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more behind-the-curtain stories from inside the monarchy. What do you think? Was this a calculated move by Kate or just tradition playing out? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read everyone. Your take might just be our next deep dive episode topic, so don't hold back.